I was asked to talk about the rise of secrecy and the nuclear state. I have an entire book on this. I'm not going to cover the entire book because I want to keep things snappy if I can. And so I'm going to be doing some sort of broad jumps. Feel free to grab me after our presentations and ask questions, either in the group or afterwards. And if somehow in this whole thing you wanted to talk to me and you didn't get to, guess what? You can email me. I'll talk to you whenever, okay? So I'm just putting that out there. Brief overview of essentially the development of nuclear secrecy itself. Secrecy around specifically nuclear weapons, which, as we'll get into, is a separate legal system from all other secrecy in the United States, which is an interesting choice. And then also its relationship to the sort of development of the Cold War national security secrecy state that we all somehow still live in, despite the Cold War having ended 30 years ago. All right, very brief overview that starts in just before World War II. In 1938, nuclear fission was discovered. We've already had a lot of discussions about nuclear fission here. It was discovered by a team working out of Germany and one in Sweden. And it was just like immediately scientists understood, around the world learned about this information. It was published as open science. And there was at least one scientist who immediately made the connection between splitting atoms and chain reactions, which allows you to have nuclear weapons potentially. And that's Leo Szilard, the guy on the right, Hungarian refugee scientist. And interestingly, his first response to this, despite being, a scientist where the norms are about publication and you publish first and quickest, and that's how you get your Nobel Prize and whatever. His insight was to try and encourage other scientists not to publish on this. And so he instituted a self-censorship campaign. So this is a private individual contacting other private individuals saying, why don't we not publish on chain reactions? Because the original discovery of fission says nothing about chain reactions. Those people hadn't thought that it was more than just like one reaction at a time. They didn't think of it as like a trillion chain reactions, which is what you need to make it explosive. And he thought, wouldn't it be great if it didn't occur to the Germans that this was the case? Why is he worried about the Germans? One, Hitler is in power, hello. Two, both he and most of the people he's talking to are European refugees from Germany. They are Jewish or of Jewish families or are married into Jewish families. So these are the people maximally afraid of a Nazi nuclear weapon. So I just want, there's a distinction here. The native-born American scientists at this time are the most resistant to the idea of secrecy because they see the risk, like what are the odds that you could take this literally tabletop science and turn it into an industry in a couple of years? Seems unlikely. The people who have already experienced Nazism are the ones not willing to take that chance. So I just want to point out secrecy is started out of fear, specific fears, and who you are changes how much fear you have. And that's sort of just an interesting little dynamic. Okay, so they initially try to get scientists to participate. They get a bunch of American scientists in journals. They get a bunch of British. They even get in Denmark. They cannot get the French to sign up for it. Sorry. The French are like, this is stupid. Everybody's going to try to discover this stuff anyway. You're not going to do it. They publish on chain reactions. The cat is out of the bag. Within 6 months, the scientists in 6 or 7 nations have written to their political leaders and said, hey, this is potentially a military technology, worst case scenario. In the United States, Szilard is the person who is doing that letter. Nobody then, or mostly now, knows who Szilard is, so he enlists his good friend, Albert Einstein, to sign this letter with him to Roosevelt, and this is sort of what kicks off very early American interest in research. I just want to point out, because this is one of my pet peeves, this is not the Manhattan Project. This is an organization they call the Uranium Committee. It is a very small, very low funded, their first budget is like $6,000. Very tiny, not that secret. They put uranium in the title, right? Like it's not as secret as it could be. The goal of this effort is not to make an atomic bomb. The goal of this effort is to find out if atomic bombs are something we should be worrying about in the short term. So I just bring this up because there's so much slippage between, oh my God, they were thinking about atomic bombs. They had an atomic bomb project. I would not call this an atomic bomb project. This is like a pre-project. this is sort of the state of things until 1941. And for conditions I'd love to take the time to get into, but we don't have the time to get into, a different group of scientists, Vannevar Bush, James Cone, and other people, get very interested in the possibility of making atomic bombs. They take over this not very effective project. They immediately rename it to something a little more cryptic, the Section S1. Deliberately don't put the word uranium in the name. It's a sign that things are getting more serious. And they start getting involved in research into essentially pilot stage uranium enrichment in nuclear reactors. So again, we've had a lot of discussion about those things today. I won't go into them, but they are wanting to show proof of concept. Can we actually do this? Could you build a factory that would enrich uranium? Could you build a nuclear reactor? So this is like the next step along the path. They do this for about a year. And then in 1942, they feel sufficiently confident that they go to FDR again, and they say, hey, this work is so confident, we could probably bang this thing out in a couple of years. You should allow us to bring in the military on this and actually build nuclear weapons. This is the Manhattan Project. So again, research project, pilot project, production project. Big shifts between these. The goal of this one is to make actual bombs that you could set off. That is not the goal of these projects. Army Corps of Engineers takes over, becomes the Manhattan Engineer District because it is actually located in Manhattan. That is not actually disinformation originally, hilariously. But later it's such a wonderfully bland name that they keep it. Manhattan Project. They are already, by this middle phase, starting to expand secrecy practices. This is a government organization, the Office of Scientific Research and Development. They are starting to keep track of who's allowed to be in on the project. They're starting to make people take oaths that they won't share any information or publish it, etc. And they're starting to think about maybe we shouldn't be working on university campuses because they're porous. Maybe we should be putting all the scientists in a lab in the middle of nowhere. I don't know where. This move to the military takes all those practices and to use a reference that will probably work with you, but no longer works with my students. They dial it up to 11. Right? They start to go extreme on all of this. So now it's okay, everybody has to be vetted by the Army or the Navy or whoever, FBI. We do want to put all the scientists in a little concentrated place. Where could we go? New Mexico. Okay, this is why we're here. They start using things like trying to censor the press. They have all sorts of techniques, and we'll get into those in a second. These are people like Oppenheimer and Rayburn. So I just want you to have this three-stage model, both for the development of the bomb, because it's my biggest pet peeve when people go from Einstein to this. I'm like, no, Einstein's not even part of this. Einstein is done after this letter, as an aside. But also that the secrecy is not something that sort of jumps out of people's heads from nothing. It starts in a very localized thing, one scientist and his fears, and then it becomes the biggest secret, most secret project in the entire wartime development, very deliberately under harsh military control. So there's a lot of ways you can frame this. One of them is the scientists start with a lot of autonomy and they lose it all. It becomes not just even a government, these are government scientists, then it becomes a government military project. Why does the secrecy expand? One, they start taking the bomb much more seriously. They start thinking about this as a real thing. They are, at the beginning of this, still convinced that Germany has an atomic weapons program. They learn by 44 that it doesn't. That doesn't stop them for a moment. They also, the size of this project is so large that the idea that you would keep it secret is almost absurd. And so that requires this massive expansion of secrecy projects. To give you an idea of how large, this is the employment roster for the Manhattan Project from 1942 to 1946. I want to see, look how low it is when they start. It's essentially zero on the map, right? This is crazy. And then these are different constructions. Here's construction at Oak Ridge, at Hanford, there's operations. Peak employment's 125,000 in July 44. This doesn't even get the actual numbers across because the working conditions at Oak Ridge and Hanford are so unpleasant. And one of the techniques for keeping the secret is not telling anyone what they're working on. So imagine you sign up for a war project and they put you in this job that is totally boring. Some of these jobs, one of the standard jobs at Oak Ridge is you sit in front of a dial and you're watching a thing go to the right, and then you turn the knob so it goes back to the middle, and then it goes to the left, and you turn the knob and it goes back to the middle. Imagine doing that for like 8 hours, just turning the knob, and nobody has told you, guess what? You're actually enriching uranium, and you're going to build a bomb in the war. Nobody's told you anything about your job other than like, yeah, it's war work. What war work? You're not producing bombs that you can see. You're not producing tanks. All your buddies are dying or fighting. People leave in tremendous numbers. Also, like, there's mud and the food is bad, and like there's all these reasons to like it. So in these months, when you see it going up by like 10,000 people per month, that is not only going up by 10,000 people per month, but they are making up a 20% rate of people leaving. So that's crazy. That's a lot of people. If you look at all the people that they gave clearances to in this period, it's 600,000 people. So 120,000, you're trying to peak 600,000. What does that mean in real terms? 1 out of 250 Americans alive worked on the Manhattan Project. That's about 1% of the entire American civilian labor force during World War II. So if you were not drafted, and you were not too old, and you were not too young, there's almost a 1 in 100 chance that you worked on the Manhattan Project. And out of all those people, my guess is that about 1% knew they were making an atomic bomb. That's incredible. So this is the job of the secrecy. It's also why it's absurd. The other thing is that this project spans the entire country. It actually spans other countries. It's not on here, but one of my favorite little things, I don't know if you know this, one of my favorite little facts. One of the little sites that they had, that they used, was in Cuba. Batista Field. They would fly from Wendover to Batista Field in B-29s to practice running what the run on Japan would look like. And they would stop, and they would pick up cigars, and they would fly back to Utah as part of the thing. Who knew? So this is like a massive, these people are all over. So every state, practically a huge number of congressional districts, there's a lot of people who are going to notice that secret work is going on. It's kind of ridiculous. One of my favorite quotes about this, Niels Bohr comes to the project in 1944. He had told people that atomic bombs probably couldn't be made, unlikely to be made, and they show him this, and he says, I told you it couldn't be done without turning the whole country into a factory. You have done just that. This is not like a little tiny project. This is not even like a weapons project in the traditional sense. This is building an entirely new industry from scratch in 2.5 years. So they went from literally the Han experiment had done on a table a little bigger than this, to this, that was in 1938, to this in like 6 years. That is not the normal pace of science. This is why Manhattan Project has become a watchword for like, wow, what if we like actually just threw all the money on it? And they didn't even start this until 42, really. So this is pretty amazing. One of my things for thinking about secrecy that I would impress upon people, secrecy can be a very vague term. I'm going to talk too much. Okay, we're allowed to say. We can get all these like tropes and cloak and dagger and weird metaphors about like leaks, water metaphors, etc. I find it really useful to focus in on like what are the practices of secrecy. The ideal of secrecy is like the word secrecy actually comes from Latin to cut. I want to cut out part of the world. I want to like take all the knowledge in the world, make a little bitty bit of knowledge over here, and restrict which people can come see my bitty bit of knowledge, right? That's what secrecy is doing in its ideal form. How do you make that real? It's one thing for me to tell you, I don't want anybody to know this. What do you do? That's what practices are. This is an anthropological, sort of sociological approach. So what are they? I'm just going to rattle off a bunch just so you can get a flavor. We can spend all day on each of these. Document control, that's what a secrecy stamp is. Secrecy stamp is so at the end of the day, you know which ones you put into a safe and you know which ones you don't. Guidelines on how to handle them. Personnel security investigations, background clearances, that's about classifying human beings, about determining which of them get to come into the place. Physical security, fences, guards, safes, these are about like denying physical access. Site isolation, putting things in Los Alamos, that's because the previous research is done in places like Berkeley, Chicago, and New York. These are like porous environments where you can't tell who's coming and leaving. Los Alamos, you can watch who's coming and leaving. Code names are obfuscating things. They don't call it uranium. They don't call it plutonium because if somebody overhears you, you want them to hear you say, oh, we're getting more copper, which then they have to say, honest to God copper, when it's actually copper. It's a little confusing. Indoctrination, what we call security culture, OPSEC. You have to convince people, especially people at this point who are not inclined to this way of life, like scientists, like not to say stuff to the wrong people. You have to burn it into their brains how to behave. Compartmentalization, this is Groves's favorite thing. This is the need to know policy. This is the idea that even within a secret system, there are secrets from people, that you only get told the little bit of information you need to know. Groves called this the heart of his security program. He was infamous, he didn't invent this, but he was infamous during World War II for taking this way further than anyone had ever taken it in the United States. Censorship wasn't voluntary of the press. We could talk about that if you're interested. Censorship of project personnel, not letting them talk to people, who write letters in some senses. Occasional misinformation, this is very relevant for the Trinity stuff. They put out deliberate misinformation. They said it was an ammunition dump explosion. They did this a couple other times. They were trying to be very judicious about this, because if you put out something fake and people think it might be fake, then you draw more attention than if you just shut up in the first place. So they are very wary about putting out fake info, but they do it a couple times, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. They have a whole counterintelligence division. They have their own internal, essentially, secrecy empire, people who can do investigations. They work with the FBI. They actually have an overseas intelligence unit that goes into Germany and France and tries to figure out what they've been doing. They have a total black budget for most of this time. They have other ways of avoiding public accountability. One of the major targets for secrecy for the Manhattan Project is Congress, because Germany and the Soviet Union and Japan cannot stop the development of the atomic bomb. But Congress can. And this is very early on. People like Vannevar Bush are saying, we are not going to be able to explain this to congressmen, that we have this crazy sci-fi project. And they actually have many, many problems during the war where congressmen try to investigate them, including famously Senator Truman, who was on a waste committee during the war. He tries to audit the Hanford site 2 or 3 times. But there are like 4 or 5 different congressmen who become aware of this like giant factory in their district that doesn't seem to be producing anything. And there's also hilarious rumors. People will report these to their congressmen. I have these reports. My favorite of the rumors is that Oak Ridge was essentially a trial communistic community for Eleanor Roosevelt. All of this gets backed up with laws. You need a punishment for violating this. That's the Espionage Act from World War I. They also can intimidate people even if they can't prosecute them. So this is like the backstop on the secrecy procedures. All of these things together, these practices, I call this a secrecy regime. So I, in my book, am analyzing different secrecy regimes across nuclear history, looking at what these practices are. The other thing that is in these regimes is like what I call the rhetoric of it, but like what are the justifications? What are your fears? What are your hopes? What are your goals? All right. I can just trim all this. I'll just do this slide and then we'll skip to the... I just want to emphasize, scientists didn't love this. Administrators didn't love this. Even the military thought this was temporary. The idea of secrecy in World War II was not what it became. The idea was these were temporary military secrets. And like D-Day plans expire, their secrecy expires like the day after D-Day, right? There's no value to them once you've already executed the military operation. So they are going into this with a different framework than emerges. And the scientists in particular are very resentful of the idea that like you can control science this way. They're willing to buckle down and do it if they're like got a good reason, but they don't think this is going to work in the post-war at all. They spend a lot of time even during the war starting to think about what it might look like after the war. How should it be run in the United States? What should secrecy or information circulation be? How should it be run globally? How do you avoid a nuclear arms race? The basic agreement among the scientists at the time is that secrecy is not going to stop nuclear proliferation. At best, it'll slow it down a tiny bit, but they see these as secrets of nature, not military secrets. And if they could have gotten this from open data, anyone else could too. They think that treaties will be able to do that. It's called international control. They think that maybe you'll have to find some way to create a world in which secrecy is not the control strategy. The statesmen also agree on this, interestingly enough, like Secretary of War. The biggest threat after World War II would be a secret nuclear arms race, but that would threaten civilization. And that basically they see 2 alternatives. Either you create a world in which war is not going to happen, especially nuclear war, and that means for them no arms race, or we all die. And we live in their worst case scenario, but okay, it's fine. And they do a lot of work to think about what you will release when you do talk about this. They are still holding back information at the end of the war, not so much because they're really sold on it as being this permanent thing, but because they're thinking, oh, we can use this to incentivize these treaties. And just a last little slide, I don't want to spend too much time here. Ultimately, what they do in very complicated legislative battles here, the post-war control of this gets defined by this bill called the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. And after going back and forth in various extremes, it creates this new Atomic Energy Commission, and it creates this parallel legal category for nuclear secrets called restricted data, the title of my book. Restricted data is a separate system from all other secrecy. So, State Department secrets, secrets about tanks, secrets about, I don't know, CIA secrets, anything like that. That's under Defense National Security Information or whatever. Nuclear weapon stuff, restricted data. Two different systems, though they overlap, so something is usually both. And restricted data is interestingly defined. All data concerning the manufacture or utilization of atomic weapons, the production of fissile material, or the use of fissionable material in the production of power. I just want to highlight a couple things here. One, all data. Does not say government-produced data. Does not say done by somebody with a clearance. The idea here, which later is called born secret, is that the data itself is inherently secret. So if I come up here and come up with a new nuclear reactor design, or a new nuclear weapons design, it doesn't matter that I don't have a security clearance. It doesn't matter that I don't have a PhD in physics. It's instantly secret according to that interpretation of this law. That gets you into really thorny First Amendment issues. It's one thing if you'd say that somebody who has a security clearance, if you get a security clearance, you sign a contract that says, if I give away secrets, I go to jail. That's relatively easy to prosecute. This is like, you could go into universities and prosecute people on the virtue of something they were just thought up in their own head with no access to classified data. Turns out it's very hard to enforce, and they basically don't enforce it. But this is a different construction of what a secret is from everything else. And it's got an interesting contrast, interesting amount of fear there. It's secret by definition unless the AEC takes out of the secrecy category. And the humorous and, I think, hilarious reason that they do this is that they are afraid that if they give this agency the power to declare things secret, it'll declare the whole world secret. So what Congress has done is declare a huge segment of the world secret and has only let them withdraw that secrecy, which is a really good evidence that the guy who did this was like, this is his first term. Like, this is a really bad system. But like, that's what he did. All right, to just jump to my big conclusion, there's a lot of more fun things we could talk about here. Like, what's the relationship between this and like the broader national security state? This is just one thing. And there's two. There's a direct and an indirect connection between the nuclear secrecy regime and everything else. The direct connection is that the Manhattan Project creates a bunch of procedures that then get adopted by the Atomic Energy Commission, that then get exported to every single federal agency. This becomes, I'm going to use a pun, the nucleus of like a spreading secrecy practices that have gotten to a point that is just sort of hard to wrap your mind around. Like the US Post Office has facilities for reading classified documents. I don't know what they're doing, but I'm just saying, like, that is not something that in 1944, 1945, you would imagine like, oh yeah, we have enough secrecy that like the postman's involved, right? Like that's a broad expansion. And a lot of these practices, one of my favorite examples of this, all declassification procedures today, you can like, as experts look at something, and they look at a manual, and they see if it's in the manual, and they write it up, and they decide that was hatched at the end of the Manhattan Project by like 7 scientists in a room over 2 days in Pasadena because they were looking for some kind of quick little plan, Oppenheimer is one of them, to think about how to have a system for releasing information. And that becomes the Manhattan Project policy, which then becomes the AEC policy, which then becomes what we do today. And it's a real shocker that 6 scientists couldn't come up with a bureaucratic policy that worked really well after only spending 2 days on it. But somehow, if you have frustrations with declassification systems, you know who to blame. The The indirect connection is that nuclear threats and the idea of the secret, which really takes off in the like sort of mid to late 40s, the idea that there are these like deadly secrets. This becomes the like underwriter for all national security secrecy in the United States. So this allows you to say that any little thing, if we lose in Vietnam, then this will happen, and that will happen, and then nuclear war, right? Like there's this domino of presumption so that any little Cold War problem, because nuclear war is at the other end of that line, the bomb allows you to find everything secret as well. So this is like what I would call like the rhetorical justification of these things as well. And by the way, just as an aside, you can see this in other nuclear states as well. The bomb ends up being the sort of radiating core of secrecy, another pun, that starts to sort of reach out, and it's this combination of practices and ideologies in any state that gets nuclear weapons. And there's an argument that's sort of inherent to it, but I think it's also, there's a lot of bureaucratic advantages to secrecy, and this is just, this ideological connection allows you to like justify as much as you want. There's more I could say, I'm not going to say, we're done. Okay, move on. So we can talk more if you want. Okay, thank you.